Hi. If you're anything like me, you probably sometimes want to know where my shirt is. Maybe that information was mentioned in a podcast somewhere, but how are you going to find it? Are you going to personally watch all the episodes of The Integral Stage and all the adjacent meta community podcasts, hoping to stumble on the information? Don't be stupid. That's too long of time. How would you even know you're checking the right podcasts? Instead, go to the Apple App Store on the internets and get Fathom.fm. Fathom.fm is a meta podcast platform that not only figures out which podcasts you should be listening to, but which parts of those podcasts contain the answers to the questions you're interested in. Fathom.fm is making podcasts searchable, instantly chapterizable, and transcribable, and training up teams of suspiciously intelligent AIs to do the work for us. The digital universe is becoming curated by conversations and interfaced with through automated dialogue processes. So if you want to put yourself in the best position for digital synchronicity and distributed sense-making this year, you may have to submit to our robot masters. Ask your doctor if cyborg interfacing is right for you. Fathom.fm. I do it.
Welcome to the next episode of Rethinking Religion. Happy to be with you again and with both of you gentlemen. And John, we're loving your new series, really enjoying it and dialoguing about it. So maybe some of that can come up in our talk today.
Great. Yeah, that'd be great.
Good. Yeah. So I believe where we left off last time was mentioning that we might go into some of the cognitive scientific dimensions of some of what we've been exploring in the last few episodes around spiritual practice and contemplation, meditation, ritual, things like that, aesthetics as well, possibly. So I wanted to start off possibly with a reference to especially Varela's work, Francisco Varela.
I always heard it pronounced Varela.
Oh, it could be. Yes, it could be Varela. Santiago School, and basically I've been aware of his work since the early 90s.
Yeah, I one of my friends and colleagues is his greatest protege, Evan Thompson.
Yes, I'm a big fan of Evan Thompson's work too.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been following that. So
really important to 40 Cog Sci. Maybe the single most important person for 40 Cog Sci right now is Evan Thompson.
I'm I will take your word for that, but I definitely hold him in high estimation. And I think the intersection of science and spirituality has been of interest to me for a long time. I've talked about my interest in Bohm here and what he was doing and what he was bringing together. Varela, I think one of the first places I encountered him and his work was at the Krishnamurti school in India. And there was an archive of his encounters with Krishnamurti, and I was really impressed with how he was able to engage with Krishnamurti, and he really kept Krishnamurti on his toes in terms of their examination of the process of cognition and its relationship to broader forms of spiritual experience. So he's impressed me from very early on and has been an influence on the articulation of integral post-metaphysical spirituality. Of course, Ken Wilber, with his idea of the marriage of sense and soul, has also been looking for a long time at the intersections of science and religion, though critical of the too loose appropriations of quantum science and things like that for spiritual associations. But one thing that I thought would be interesting to touch on from Varela's work, and I know that it gets carried forward with Evan Thompson too, is the central role of imagination.
Yes.
His slogan that perception is as imaginal or imaginary as imagination is perceptual, that they both are mutually informing and constraining with each other. And although he doesn't treat it uniquely so, he suggests that imagination is like a mixed object, and we can look at it in terms of the synchronization of multiple, brain and body sites. And we can also look at it as a global emergent system, and that there's possibility for local to global and global to local influence within the imagination, and that because it spans multiple systems, it's a really privileged place to work. And he has a really beautiful article with Natalie DePraz talking about the central role of imagination as a mixed object, and he uses Tibetan Tonglen as a kind of use case. And so one of the things that's interesting to me there is we sometimes talk about, shamanic practice. And one of the framings in shamanism is that, if you're going to affect healing, they're relatively critical of the verbal therapy and interventions. And they would suggest that you usually need to move to the level of at least the imaginal and symbolic to affect changes in the deeper system, or move at the level of the energetic. And we may not have to get into the level of what they mean by the energetic, but the imaginal is very important there. And Varela talks about how Tonglen makes use of kind of the already holographically embedded social systems that we have in the forms of relationships that we have, but then it interacts imaginally with those things to affect changes and enabling a kind of a global to local change on our overall self-constitution. And he looks at Tonglen as a really special case. In Tonglen, you're working with already deeply embedded neural networks and everything for social systems and empathic relations, but amplifying or changing or modifying that in profound ways that actually has measurable effects. So that's something I wanted to put in there is just the central role of imagination and how ritual and spiritual practice can effectively invoke the imagination to work those kinds of changes and play that kind of mediating role. Then there are other things about cognitive science that we could look at in terms of its affordances and limitations when you bring it into contact with spiritual practices, or something like neurophenomenology and the importance of integral methodological pluralist approaches. And so there could be other things we look at, but that's where I wanted to start.
Well, that's a great place to start. My problem here is there's so much I want to say because I've been doing a lot of work around the imaginal and ritual. It might be good to remind people of it looks like it's independently mentioned or discovered by different people, like I think it's Shelley or Coleridge and Corbin. But nevertheless, I prefer Corbin's distinction, and I think it's helpful. And then to unpack it. But I want to try and do something else. I want to try and show why. Varela once wrote a thing about how he found the Dharma implicit in 4 ecog psi, and I want to argue that the imaginal is implicit in 4 ecog psi in just the same way. So Corbin's notion, Corbin is a philosopher, historian. I believe he was at the Sorbonne at some point. He studied. He was an avowed Neoplatonist, so he's on my side of the tracks, and he was very interested in Persian philosophy, but philosophy, mysticism, transformative practice as a constellation. So he made a distinction between the imaginary, which is the visualization of we'll use visual, although it can be done auditory, tactile, etc., but just to keep it sort of smooth. When you visualize mental images, and so I can ask you to do it right now. I can say, in your mind, picture a sailboat, and then I ask you, are the sails up or down? And you can say they're up or they're down, and it's basically taking you away from perception. And we've placed a lot of store on that. In fact, we've sort of reduced the notion of imagination to that, and that's kind of unfortunate because it's not clear how functional that mental picturing is, because we now have pretty non-controversial, reliable evidence that 5 to 10% of the population can't do that thing, that forming of mental pictures, and they do not seem to suffer any cognitive, psychosocial, ethical. They do not seem to suffer in any way, any deficit. Now, you have to compare that to something else they can do, and this gets us into the imaginal, which is you can put them into a room they're familiar with, and darken, turn the lights off and say, well, where's the window in the room? And they can point to it and stuff like that. They can do that, but they'll tell you, I'm not forming any mental picture. I just know that it's there and that sort of thing. So the imaginal is not forming mental pictures in your mind. It's not imagination that takes you away from perception. It's imagination in the sense of enacting a particular perspective and often a particular identity, so that one sensitizes oneself, one enhances one's perception and imagination. And I use as a standard example, when I'm teaching people Tai Chi Chuan, I say, imagine you're standing in a river and your feet are sinking, your knees to your feet are sinking into the mud, your knees to your navel area are in flowing water. You want that to feel like flowing water, force with flexibility. And from your navel above is in the air, you want it to feel rarefied and as empty as air. Now, people are typically not picturing anything. What they're doing is they're trying to act as if they are in that situation, what the salience landscaping would be like, how they'd be inhabiting their mind and body, how they'd be sensitizing their awareness. And this allows them to pick up on otherwise subtle sensory motor patterns. And of course, you see children doing the same thing developmentally. They will pretend to be mom or dad, or they'll pretend to be a fireman, or they will pretend to be Superman. And they're not picturing Superman, they're enacting what it would be like to be Superman and doing the same perspectival and participatory serious play. And so that role of imagination as, I'm sorry, no pun intended, as integral to perception and cognition. This, of course, was part of what Corbin argued, that the imaginal is that which interpenetrates, binds together, and makes mutually accessible to each other the intelligible domain and the sensible domain. So that's one dimension of the imaginal. He also understood that the imaginal also bridges between the subjective and the objective domains. I think he was aware of, although I don't remember reading in him where he foregrounds it, but it's certainly deeply implicit that the imaginal also bridges the aspirational developmental. When I'm here, I'm this person here now, and I want to be that person there then. Like that happens in religious conversion or therapy, or when you aspire to cultivate a virtue, all that aspirational transformational stuff. And the imaginal also properly bridges between the individual and the collective, and that can either be a social collective or it can be a hyper object of some kind. We use so there's those sort of four dimensionals, four ways in which it bridges, and therefore it's very much a nexus for getting a meta optimal grip on reality. If you intervene there and you find that sort of proper stance in there that gives you the best access to those four dimensions of transformation, it is a pivotal, and by the way, that's an imaginal thing to say, it's a pivotal thing to do. Now, I want to point out, and then I'll try to be as quick as possible so Layman can, I want to try and point out some areas in which the imaginal is deeply implicit in cognitive science. One is the recognition within embodiment and language of the ongoing presence of the imaginal. And the clearest example of this is gesture. So gesture is not ornamentation. We're gesturing, in which we are often enacting something, and we're enacting it imaginally. I'm doing this thing with my hand because I'm trying to indicate in action, and I'm trying to get the notion of I'm trying to convey something that I can't say, and it's the use of imagery. And then the point, and this comes from the work of Lakoff and Johnson and a bunch of other people. I'll say it one more time because people keep misattributing to me. I totally agree with their discovery of the phenomena. My published criticisms are of their theoretical explanation, because I don't think their theoretical explanation of the phenomena is good. But that conceptual metaphor, it runs through our gestures, either our embodied actual physical gestures, or even the gesturing we do in speech. When I say, do you see my point? Do you get what I'm saying? I hope you understand it. I hope you can grasp it. We're doing all of that exaptation. So the imaginal is properly found throughout our cognition because of the way cognition is exaptive. And it's doing that bridging from the intelligible to the sensible, etc. So that's, and then the recognition of how pervasive and profoundly functional that is in our cognition already situates the imaginal at an important role. Two other places, and I won't go into it in great detail, but this is a lot of my current work. One of the biggest models we have right now, and I'm working with other people to integrate relevance realization theory with this, is called Friston's predictive processing model. It's also called Bayesian brain. It's also blah, 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 blah. I think the predictive processing is the best naming for it. And this is the idea that you have layers, and the brain is not trying to directly predict the world. It's trying to predict its lower order sensory motor patterns and reduce surprise. And what you have is layers. The bottom layer is interacting with the world. The layer above it is trying to predict and complete it. And then the layer above that is trying to predict and complete the second layer, and it's recursive. And what you have basically is you have prediction completion flowing top down and error signal flowing bottom up. And it massively, recursively, dynamically is self-organizing. So why does that matter for what we're talking about? Because most of the time you're ignoring a lot of the error signal because it's irrelevant. That's where relevance realization comes in, and I won't go into that in great detail. But what that means is, take, for example, walking. Walking is an inherently imaginal act. Why? Because if you were to rely just on your sensory motor loop, you would have to walk quite slowly. And you can walk quite rapidly, and more tellingly, you can run. And you can't do the sensory motor loop fast enough. So you're relying on your cerebellum to actually predict and complete what the terrain is going to be like and how your legs should be moving. Now, you pay for a price for that, right? If you make the wrong prediction, you'll stumble. But the cerebellum's gotten very good at predict. So you're actually not mostly sensing the ground, you're predicting it. It's imaginal. Imagination. The arrows are, imagination is the top-down process of prediction completion. Perception is the error up, and they completely interweave and interpenetrate, right? So when you're running, it's imaginal. It's imaginal through and through. And many of the things, when you're looking at a wall and you're seeing the entire wall as white, that's mostly imaginal, because you can't actually take in, like your eye does not subtend enough of the wall. You take in little samples and then you make a prediction. And so most of that perception is not detection, it is imaginal. Now, it's not imaginary, it's not a hallucination, because true predictions are true. Right? And most of the predictions are true, and that's why it works. Now, you pay the price that there is actually small deviations in the hue of the wall, but you don't care, right? And so it's imaginal that way. One last thing, and then I'll stop. If you take a look at deep learning, and you look at the core of it, which is Geoffrey Hinton, right? You go through two phases. One phase, the system is taking in information from the world and doing data compression on it and abstracting some invariants. That's the recognition. And then you go into the generation phase, and he calls it fantasy in the original wake-sleep algorithm paper, by the way. He calls it fantasy. What the system does is it disconnects from the world and it generates fantasies, variations on those invariants. Right. And that sensitizes the recognition system to sort of initially look for those patterns. And then most of them get killed off. And then, but some of them survive, and you get a nuance, a complexification of the pattern of the invariants that are picked up from the world. And you're constantly cycling, and it's, you know, and it's suggested that this is what dreaming does. It does this fantasy generation. It also prevents us from overfitting to the sample, all kinds of, so the fantasizing is not ornamental. It is indispensable to the system actually evolving its pattern detecting abilities. And right at the core. So in all of these ways, at least these three ways, the imaginal is strongly implicit as being indispensable to our proper and best cognitive functioning. So I think it is high time that we bring the imaginal back into the forefront, because it's already there, and I've been arguing for that. And I won't go on to the next point because I want to give space to Layman. But I think ritual is about how to properly take up in serious play the imaginal, such that it transfers broadly and deeply to the non-ritualized domains of one's life. And I think that is central, actually, to becoming a rational, virtuous, and therefore wise being. And I'll leave it at that.
When I was really little, I couldn't ride a bike, and we had this bike that a neighbor had given us that was way too big for me, and I used to have to climb up on the fence to get onto the bike, and I would push off and coast as far as I could. And I would pretend I was riding a bike until it ran out of steam and I had to jump off. And then one day in doing this, I coasted way too far and looked down and noticed I was riding a bike and could ride a bike ever since. So I really appreciate the idea that the imaginal plays an intermediary role between perception and prediction and allows us to sort of glue together different aspects of our experience in order to be able to enact patterns at new levels. That's one of the areas of the imaginal I'm very interested in. I'm highly interested in the use of imagination, in particular inner practices where you isolate the imaginal domain and try to inhabit it very specifically, just as an imaginer or even as a sort of imaginal version of yourself. And that leads to the third area that I'm very interested, which is where I think a lot of esoteric religion and cognitive science might come together, which is in the amplification of the imaginal. So there's a sense in which the imaginal is involved in all of my perceptions, but then I can do this other thing where I can evoke a more salient aspect of the imaginal into some of the perceptions I'm having right now. Chogyam Trungpa used to say, the green is so green. So there's this sense of increased vividness. There's also a sense in which a number of esoteric traditions believe you can develop a kind of imaginal body, subtle body, body of fire. There's these various ways of thinking about it. You already have this one. This one is already implicitly imaginal in your experience of it. But then you do some other set of practices to take that imaginal quality up a notch. So my key area of interest here, what's standing out for me most at the moment, is how do we use a deeper cognitive understanding of how the imaginal permeates all these aspects of cognition to tell us more about how we might be able to take the imaginal to the next level?
Yeah, it may interest you to note, Layman, both last July and earlier in January, earlier this year, in two different, one was in Tuscany and the other one was at Esalen. I gave presentations on the relationship between the imaginal and the so-called subtle bodies that appears cross-culturally, cross-historically, cross-traditionally, and basically arguing. Apparently, it's been labeled the third paradigm for the work on this. I didn't realize that. Arguing for an imaginal interpretation of subtle bodies as opposed to just a straightforward sort of substance realism about subtle bodies. Because I'm very interested in, I've been doing Tai Chi Chuan for like 3 decades, and I'm interested in Qi and what is going on there. And I think it has to do with an imaginal reappropriation and enhancement of our fundamental transjective nature of the body. Merleau-Ponty's idea that the body is a chiasm, and Evan Thompson famously wrote about the body problem. And I think one of those bodies would probably count as a subtle body in many traditions. Now, the difficulty around this is, and I don't mean this for either one of you, and I don't even mean it for any of the people that I was interacting with at these conferences, but there's also a lot of bad woo around this stuff, like a lot of bad woo, because the imaginal, and here's the dark side of the imaginal, because of how implicit and nexus it is, but because it involves, well, the imagination, so the use of imagery, is also a place of, it's also a location in which bullshitting oneself is very, very possible. We are very, very prone to it in there. And so I'm trying to also understand, and for me right now, it's via ritual, because it's very clear the other way works, that rationality depends on the imaginal. Like, I think I'm like Hirschfeld's work. You go in, remember I mentioned this about the people saving for the retirement. Did I do that discussion with you? Like, you go in and you give the academics all the evidence and all the argument that they should start saving for the retirement right now, and then they don't. And then you come back and it's because they don't want to be imaginally related to their future self, because their future self is old and ugly and their career is over. Right. And what you do is you say, I want you to imagine your future self as a beloved family member that you've always cared for and you love and you want to keep caring for. And when you come back in 6 months, now people are saving, and the more vividly they imagined it, the more they saved. And then you just lump that into Agnes Callard's work, that we aspire to being rational. I'm not currently rational. I want to be rational. So I need the imaginal in order to get the self-regulation, in order to do the, the aspiration and go through the transformative experience. I won't repeat all those arguments, right? Because I've already touched on them. So it's clear that the rational depends on the imaginal, and it depends on, in fact, I would argue, the ritualization of the imaginal. But I also want to know, I want to try and get the other way. Like how can we, and this is what I mean by rationality, how can we properly, reflectively evaluate and correct for the possibilities of bullshitting within the imaginal? I think ritual is an important way because there's a rationality to ritual, which I've already mentioned. But I'm wondering if either one of you or both of you have thoughts on how do we, because I've seen it in dojos. I've seen sifus do bullshitty things around chi, right? And some of them are just charlatans, and that's just bad faith actors everywhere. But some of them are not. Some of them are definitely bullshitting themselves. And you just have to do a couple of, almost like a James Randi, a couple of controls, and all of the goes away, right? And so how do we properly bring rationality as the reflective response to the like really reflective and effective response to the possibility of self-deception in the imaginal? That's my concern.
Let me just throw two quick things in before we go to Bruce here. One is, I'm interested in the role that the training languages have played in enabling that condition. Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of poetic, hyperbolic, and colloquial phraseology used in training languages.
Yes.
And they make it very easy for people to take an imaginary rather than an imaginal relationship to this stuff. The other thing that I
think that's well placed. I think the training and explaining is a big mistake. I just want to reinforce that. I agree. There's a training explaining thing that equivocation. I think that's very dangerous. I just want to reinforce that. I think that's an excellent point.
I was thinking about that learning experience I had with the bicycle.
Yeah.
And the possibility of ritual as a kind of meta-imaginal act, in the sense that a well-designed ritual might be able to show forth the cognitive machinery involved in those transformations.
Yes.
And so rituals of that kind could go a long way to bringing the imaginal and the rational together, but rituals in other patterns might not do that. So I think we should be looking at how well a ritual enacts the entire process that we're discussing.
So degree to which it exemplifies, is that, am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, exactly. So that the participants would sort of walk through the very process that we're saying is at the root of how the imaginal functions as part of cognitive transformations.
Right.
Bruce?
Yeah, so much to answer to. One thing that I think is helpful, or would be helpful, I think, is just the rehabilitation of imagination in our discourse. I think the separation of that's just imaginary and this is real leads oftentimes to people wanting to pursue the imaginary reactively because they don't see a healthy integration of the imaginal and the transformative potential of imagination in perception, in growth, in self-unfolding. And if that was better integrated in our understanding, I think people wouldn't feel a need to retreat to the away from, the imagined deficient approach, of science or whatever. So I think that would be a good thing there. And in terms of my own practice contexts, generally I've been around charlatan teachers as well, but for the most part, it's actually really beautiful and remarkable how sometimes within a deeply esoteric tradition, you can come to the teacher to report an experience, and they clearly recognize that you're just lost in imaginary thinking about something and actually not rooted in embodied transformative practice. And they'll just point that out, right? So for me, the good teachers do recognize what the evocation of the symbol and the image means in terms of the marshaling the whole system of the body and undergoing transformation, and are able to identify where you're actually just running off in your own, idiosyncratic directions or indulging imagination. A couple things that I was thinking about in terms of John, when you were pointing to that imagination is more than visual, it's an embodied and everything.
Yeah.
And don't know if there's much to say here, except I was thinking the work of Arnold Mindell is pretty interesting in this area. And I don't know if you guys know him, but he does the process work. But one of the things that he talks about is the dream body. And one of the things that he contends is that essentially the body is dreaming all the time. And another way to say that is the body is immersed in the imaginal all the time in many, many layers. And that he has practices for channel switching within the body to actually highlight where imaginal streams are running. Or if you're engaging in the body's function in one way, and then you switch your attention over to a different channel within the body, you can actually find an imaginal reflection or amplification of what's going on in this domain. And so there are skillful ways to move between the channels to bring out the implicit imaginal story behind a gesture, behind different ways of acting or moving. And then there are processes for unfolding and unpacking that imaginal content, because often there are somatic and emotional and other pieces of content. So to bring that out gives you access to a lot of material to work with. And I've seen it be pretty deeply and radically transformative for people in a very short amount of time. The last thing, maybe anecdotal a little bit, is just to talk about dream and sleep yoga. I've done a lot of training with the Tibetan Lama in dream and sleep yoga for a number of years when I lived with him. And one of the practices in dream yoga is in the daytime to walk around and just say, this is a dream, or relate to what you're experiencing as a dream. And when I first received those kinds of teachings, I was not comfortable with them because of an older understanding of imagination and of dreams. I felt it was a push in the direction of devaluing or derealizing the world. And so I was not comfortable with that instruction. But on engaging it, it actually changed for me, because I found that, and I'm bringing up this anecdotal piece because I want to relate it to what Layman mentioned in terms of how can spiritual practices and rituals function to amplify the imaginal within experience for transformative purposes. And for me, I found that that was the case with not only that part of the dream yoga work, but actually the entire suite of practices, which are pretty complex. But that piece of it, of relating to the world as a dream, served to amplify, clarify, vivify most of my modes of experience, so that I was able to attend to them much more deeply and in a more participatory way. By pronouncing it dream, I was actually pronouncing my own involvement in the whole phenomenal display in a way that amplified it for me, and it made it a little bit more plastic and flexible. There's some danger you can go in the direction of diluted behaviors and beliefs, but in a good practice context, that doesn't happen. Then the very last piece that I wanted to bring in terms of the imaginal and the subtle body, just in our conversation with Robert about your series and the daimonian, and one of the things that I mentioned was the tulpa practice.
Tulpa Mansuri. Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting thing to look at.
I want to talk to some of the people that are doing that and some of the people that are studying it.
Yeah. So that's it. Yeah.
I want to say, first of all, I think you've pointed out a fifth dimension of the imaginal, which also is implicit on Corbin, especially in his interactions with Jung, which is the imaginal as mediating between the conscious and the unconscious. I forgot that's a fifth dimension, and I think you're pointing to that. I think you're also pointing to that two correctives we could look for. We could look within the practices, how well does it tap into all 5 of these dimensions? Right? I think that's a good internal criteria. And then there's an external one, which is how much is your community giving that that appropriate recognition, almost in the Hegelian sense, that recognition of your transformation. Because as you say, other people in your community and your teacher, your guru can say, no, that's just imaginary. And so there's also the degree to which people outside, I think, for example, that just because of some of my own experience and some of the time when I talk to people who do the dream work, which seems, I want to talk to you some point, Bruce, because it does seem to be affected by aging, the effectiveness of some of those practices. But nevertheless, I think when those dream yogas are pursued in an individualistic fashion, the autodidactism starts to run really wild for some of the people on this, because they're not in a community. So I'm just saying that I think 3 things came out for me that were very helpful. One was that 5th dimension of the imaginal, and this was, of course, Jung's idea of the archetypes as properly imaginal, right? As mediating between the conscious and the unconscious. And that overlaps with all the other ones really clearly, and a lot of the functionality I was talking about. And then what I got out of it were 2 evaluative criteria. One was, to what degree is your practice tapping into and coordinating well in a coherent manner all 5 of these dimensions? Mm-hmm. And then to what degree is it being received and recognized by a community of fellow practitioners?
In doing, just to throw in just a sentence here, in doing the dream yoga work and the sleep yoga work, I've only ever learned it in a pretty tight communal context.
Yeah.
And that's been an essential dimension. There are actually people there within the ritual, within the practice. Sometimes, like the sleep yoga, you go without sleep for 3 days, but you're supported by individuals in different ways to take you to a ritual moment of entering the citadel of sleep. But you do it in a communal way, and there's intersubjective testing and correlation and support that I think has been essential. And I think people who just go to the workshop or pick up the book and begin to do, they're all the autodidactic dangers you pointed to, that if you're
yeah.
I remember hearing a poet say that he became a poet because he didn't have enough imagination to be a mathematician. And I think there's something to that in terms of first of all, you
live such a rich life. You are just a continual fountain of these amazing things, like these little statements, these aphorisms, these micro anecdotes. I like, it's just continually impressive.
That came up for me in response to Bruce's comment that a lot of people turn to the imaginal as a reaction away from social and intellectual contexts in which it seems to be marginalized. And so you definitely need a community that affirms it, and affirms it in a way that's sort of stronger than the other options that are available. And the other options that are available are not just derealized, narcissistic, imaginal retraction from the world, but it's also having the imaginal co-opted by cult and clan and marketers and all that sort of thing, right? There are dangers out there that need to be faced by having a practice community that really strongly has the imaginal and in a rich, balanced way. And one of the things I think that makes it rich is training in the ability to find it everywhere. Because a lot of people who are doing that reactive move, they don't really see that science is full of the imaginal. They don't have those examples. They're not falling in love with Einstein's imaginal capacity. They're not seeing it pervasively enough. And so they're looking for it in these little pockets. So that stood out to me. Another element that stood out to me was a tendency of the solipsistic imaginal to deny intensities of various kinds, right? There's a tendency to stay in a very fluid, very amenable, I can just imagine whatever I want. Alice says this in Alice in Wonderland, that she basically has the right and the capacity to imagine all kinds of impossible things. which is true. You can imagine pretty much anything you want, but in that statement, she's not willing to go to places in the imaginal that have the force or intensity of a logical connection, right? She doesn't allow herself the sensations of the impossible. So there's a retraction away from a certain kind of boundary condition that prevents the imaginal from accessing reality really well.
I think that's really good. I like that. And I like that criteria you just brought out about, right, about building, continuity between, I don't know what to call it, sort of very esoteric experiences of the imaginal and then the everyday. I think that's also a very good grounding phenomena. And then, yes, the degree, I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but I think it's maybe it could at least overlap. If you're picking up on these variations in the intensity, you're also, what comes across with Alice is I can imagine everything, but that in no way challenges anything that I actually already believe. So, right, this is part of what's going on with Alice, right? And so the idea that in that the proper relationship to the imaginal has the ability to call one to serious self-correction in some fashion. It's not just self-indulgence. It has to challenge, it has to be able to break your frame, not just make your frame, to use some of my language. I think that's also an important criteria. So if somebody comes to me and said, and you mentioned that, the demonium and the Hermes and for me, how that works is the degree to which there's calls to self-correction that come out of those dialogues, and there's and there's proposals for practice, and there's all this stuff which is often very, very left field and challenging to me. Like there was a proposal, maybe you should go and reread the New Testament. It's like, what? Something like that, right? It's because, right, maybe it's time to reconsider and your interaction with those kinds of texts. And then that actually turned out to be weirdly and unpredictably beneficial. It's led to some of these great conversations I'm having with Bishop Maximus, and you can see this thing opening up that you could not have foreseen. Whereas I think if the imaginal is just self-indulgent and a lot of self-fulfilling fantasies in the negative sense of the word, like that, I think is also a marker. I don't know if you were exactly proposing that, but it sounded to me like the degree to which the imaginal seriously challenges you for significant self-correction. I think that's also something to look for within imaginal ritual. Is that okay with you, Layman? Does that land well?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it, right? The imaginal is we can imagine it as a realm, and that realm contains not only things that are fluid, but also things that hold themselves in place, that challenge you.
Yes.
Right? That the great scientists who access the imaginal, they're accessing places where they're finding an invariance. That's what Einstein called it originally, invariance there, right? You find something, I can't change that, and I can't change that, and I can't change that. It's in the imaginal, but I don't get to just say whatever I want about it. It now challenges me forth. There's a variety of types of boundary conditions within the imaginal. And if you're not encountering those, you have a really impoverished way of experiencing the imaginal.
I think that's right. That's very good. That's very good. Yeah. So it's similar to Husserlian phenomenology. When you do all the variations, and this goes back to the deep learning, you do all the variations to disclose some of these deep invariants. And then that reminds me of the notice invariance heuristic within insight. Often what you need to do in order to go in an insight is you need to look through all your failures to notice what is invariant, because that's what you probably need to change and you're not changing. And so I'm just sparking on that sort of phenomenological variation that discloses invariance. And then you have to pick up on the discernment of, is the invariance something that you're making it invariant, or is it invariant, an invariance that's challenging you to recognize its independent reality?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting piece, because One, it can reveal the deep architecture of your own presuppositions,
Yes.
your own ways of looking that, as David Bohm would put it, carry the force of necessity. It may not be that they're necessary, but in your own deep presuppositions, you have certain elements that carry for you the force of necessity, and then they repeat. But there could be also aspects of what you're encountering that are invariant from that side, right?
Yes.
Not,
Yes.
yeah. So I think that's a really interesting edge to explore. Dream yoga definitely focuses on that. There's aspects of the dream yoga practice where it deliberately asks you to break the boundaries of your self-organization experimentally, to see what's possible, what's not possible, what does it teach you about yourself. And so it's not just an indulgence and I can do anything in a dream, but it's test the boundaries of your perceptual world and find out what is something that just carries the force of necessity for you, and find out also maybe what is an actual limit. So I think that's a really interesting practice. And just coming to my mind, this is something maybe we could talk about in another talk. I need to go deeper myself, but I think John Salas's work around the force of imagination and what he's trying to do to reinvigorate a phenomenology of imagination, but a science of imagination and a hermeneutics of imagination is important, and maybe something to come back to. We've circled around his work in our integral post-metaphysical talk, but maybe there's more to go into later. In terms of what we focused mostly on imagination, which I love, less than the cognitive science piece. Do you all want to go on further with anything on imagination, or take up any other questions in our last little bit around cognitive science and the interface? I'll just say one of my questions or concerns was, one of my friends is Ron Purser is the author of the McMindfulness book.
Yes. Yes.
And that's gotten a lot of attention. And
as it should. I think he's put his finger on a real thing and a real problem.
Definitely, I agree. I agree. And he's, a very serious practitioner. He actually got me to go buy a book called Transcendence to look at even the cultural appropriation of sacred art, and in terms of how it's become a commodity, and it's gotten divorced from its deeper roots and its transcendental possibilities. But in any event, with the McMindfulness piece, it's just a really clear reminder of how we can extract these technologies, and even to call it a technology, extract these practices from their contexts in various ways, can both be facilitative for some kind of growth, and it can make something new move in the culture, which we don't need to dismiss, but it can also it can really fall short of the potential of those practices as they exist within their own living contexts. So the question here is, how can a deepening, growing dialogue between cognitive science and spirituality and religion and religious practice happen in a way that doesn't contribute to the mindfulification of all of these things, but actually can be capacitating and empowering and mutually informing. And I don't know if there's an easy answer except just being mindful of the potential, but that's something I want to use.
Oh, no, I think there's a deeper answer, and I've been pursuing it. I mean, it's precisely because of my cognitive science that I've published critiques of the uptake, both within academia and in the popular culture, of mindfulness and its deformation into things like McMindfulness. I think cognitive science properly pursued, and this is something I argue for, I don't just state it, is the attempt to get a synoptic integration between many different disciplines: neuroscience, artificial intelligence, psychology, linguistics, cultural anthropology, and philosophy, right? So that we're trying to get at the whole of the phenomena, all of its levels, all of the ways in which those levels constrain and causally interact. And the pursuit of that synoptic integration is actually really resistant to a lot of reduction and commodification. And so, and I've published a couple things. I've published in 2016 with Leo Ferraro on reformulating the mindfulness construct, and then recently in the Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Meditation, edited by the amazing Rick Rapetti, that just came out last year. I've published in that too, and try to develop this. But I think this is not just for mindfulness, and this is how I think that a strong case could be made. I think that intelligence, consciousness, all important mental constructs, to use as neutral a term as I possibly can, should be subjected to the demand that they pursue as much as they possibly can, the synoptic integration between all of the mind-oriented disciplines. And I think when that is done properly, and I think that is the proper way to do cognitive science, because none of the disciplines actually talk about the relationship between their domains, and yet it's very plausibly the case that the brain level and the information processing level and the behavioral level and the linguistic level and the cultural level are all interpenetrating, causally interacting, constraining each other, etc. And that the individual cognition and distributed cognition are doing all of that. And so I think we have specialization, and that has served us very well, but we also need synoptic integration. And I think part of what we've developed is something like an attractor, and it's a noxious attractor between specialization and commodification. Specialization of knowledge pursuit tends to afford commodification, because you pick up on just one aspect that has been made salient and then you market it. But I think if cognitive science is properly pursued, it is pursuing synoptic integration, which deeply resists that over specialization, and it deeply resists commodification. So I think there should be, and there properly can be, a deep alliance between cognitive science properly pursued, or at least the vision I argue for, and other people do too, by the way, and the resistance to commodification. Now, I'll just say, and Rick says this too, McMindfulness is better than nothing.
Yes.
Right. And so we have to make these critiques around, you're doing something good, but we often pursue evil, not by pursuing evil, but by pursuing a lesser good at the expense of a greater good. Right. That's the kind of argument I've been trying to make with people. Yes, it's good, do it. But if you do it right, you can do it in a way, because of the way it's been formatted and presented to you, that actually prevents you from pursuing a greater good that is possible through mindfulness practices. So those are my 2 points of I think there's a strong argument for a deep alliance between cognitive science and the resistance of commodification.
Yeah, I think that's it's a contemporary instantiation in my mind of the deep alliance between social challenge and wisdom that have always existed. Right. And I think that's insofar as cognitive science generates itself to the point that it enacts wisdom, it'll probably do what we've seen it do before. Like you were mentioning in that last video about the cynics, right? There's a very close role between the philosophy and the public challenge.
Right.
Because they're both trying to empower people at a level separate from the mere social convention that they're trapped in, the habit form that they're in. Although I like, McMindfulness is better than nothing is great. And I think it is important to remember that any form can become deep.
Yes.
Right. Like a deep atheist can encounter the divine more than a superficial theist.
Yes.
So any form, if we take it right, if we tease it apart to see what its depth-oriented possibilities are apart from its superficially oriented possibilities, we should be able to find a navigational possibility toward depth within any form that we're given. When it comes to sort of last thoughts about ritual and cognitive science here, one of the things that strikes me, an interesting element of the cognitive science seems to be this alternation between high coordination and distributed parts, right? Because there's work involved in bringing things together. And a ritual should be able to demonstrate that it starts in a sort of dispersed place and it comes together and causes an integration through the use of the imaginal. And then it separates out again so that there can be both rest and a reestablishment of enough difference of information in those parts that they can come back together. Now, something does build up, integration does accumulate to some degree, but I think that the key imaginal ritual that demonstrates the cognitive science patterning should have this fluxing together into integration and fluxing back apart.
Very much, very much. Well, I would say for me, and I didn't bring it out as an explicit one, I think that ritual, like we evaluate a ritual in terms of how it's complexifying cognition such to enhance relevance realization in a reliable and comprehensive manner. For me, that's sort of the final sort of functional requirement. Is it doing that? Is it complexifying cognition in exactly the way you said, in a way that reliably and pervasively enhances relevance realization? And for me, that's what a lot of religious ritual, I think, has aspired to do. And I think when it's working well and it discovers the depth dimensions like you're talking about, Layman, I think there's I think we should rehabilitate ritual in our understanding the way we should rehabilitate the imaginal that Bruce has been arguing for. Ritual has been, because of Freud, ritual has been reduced to the compulsive, and because of our post-Protestant rain shadow, it's either the compulsive or the meaningless act. That's what the term refers to now, which of course are neither one are proper denotations of ritual. They are peripheral connotations that point to pathological possibilities rather than prototypical realities. And so I think we also have to rehabilitate ritual in that way because of what you just said.
One other thing, because I guess we're at the end here, is a suggestion I would have for further discussion would be to bring in the idea of the energetic that Bruce mentioned at the beginning.
Sure.
Right. That the subtle domain, so to speak, is often characterized as both the vital and the astral. So there's a notion of the affective and the bioelectrical and that sort of thing, as well as the notion of the imaginal, and how do those work together in a way that's not diluting, is a really interesting question.
Mm.
Yeah, that would be really rich. Just on what you were saying in terms of the gathering and integrating and separating, and I think, we find that in ritual, in authentic ritual, definitely in tantric practice. There's the generation stage and then the completion stage, which is basically the consolidation of an intensified, sphere of experience, and then the deliberate dissolution.
Right.
And I think that's, it's ironic that ritual has come to mean that which is dead and mindless, rather than that which is actually the site of the intensification of our embodied mindedness and all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I like people don't realize the pervasiveness. Like, your introspective space is imaginal. It's not literally in your head. Other cultures have placed it in other areas of the body, but people, they forget that the introspective space is an imaginal space, and most of the a lot of the cognitive science say it's imaginal to give you access to cognition that we otherwise don't have access to, right? And so I like, if we could get people to realize it. I tried to do this in a talk at Cambridge, like what you were proposing, Bruce, for the imaginal, to get people to see how the imaginal is pervasive in everyday experience. Ritual, at least the implicit sense of ritual, is also pervasive in people's experience in a lot of ways. And I think we should be doing that. I'm very up, by the way, to talking about what Layman proposed, as long as and I think we would be, we open it up beyond the very recent notion of energy as trying to describe this, which is a Western, especially post-World War II development. And I saw some excellent presentations about the development of these terms at Esalen by a Reiki scholar. So, we go back, you get very different terms. You get musical terms, you get terms around a mystery, right? And so as long as we're willing to play with that and not be too bound to to the term energy, which I think has become a little bit imperious about this stuff, that I would like to partake in it.
Definitely, yeah, I
Fantastic.
second that. So look forward to that with all of you.
Yep.
And wonderful to be with you again together.
Excellent.
Be well, gentlemen.
You too.
Take care.